All right, so we talked about meditation literature last week, and in a sense, this next few lessons are going to be an extension of that, and that all of the different subgenres within the Bible are a part of meditation literature. But I want to take it today and talking about narrative. Now, narrative it makes up the majority of Scripture. Most of Scripture you're going to find if you open to a random page in the Bible, odds are good that you're going to find at least some narrative on that page. And so, before we really jump into how to read narrative, let's just define our terms. So, when it comes to narrative or literature, when it comes to literature, what is narrative? Well, at its most basic level, narrative is classic storytelling. So, storytelling, anybody, we've all told stories, we've all been told stories, and so narrative is the form, is just telling a story. And that story can be true, that story can be fake, it can be whatever, or some combination of the two. But in the end, this is just, put simply, telling a story. Now, like I said, this does make up the majority of Scripture. Now, God could have written just a rule book, but instead He chose to communicate with us in the way that we understand best. And what I mean by this is that stories are remembered up to 22 times as much as facts alone. I mean, if I just give you a list of facts and you're supposed to remember those facts, and then ask you 10 minutes later to remember those facts, or an hour later, or the next day, or whatever, um, you're probably not going to remember those facts near as well. But if I give you a list of those same facts in story form, and I tell you just to like a story about each of those facts, you will probably remember the facts far better, and that is because they're remembered up to 22 times as much. You're more likely to remember them. And so the good news about the Bible being composed primarily of narrative is that it's probably the least intimidating literary genre to read, and God uses this to communicate with us the truth of Scripture in a way that, while it's not list format, which may be frustrating at times, in the end, it's much more interesting to read. It's the easiest, generally speaking, to just pick up and read. Even understanding it still takes some work, but in general, we can shorten them into children's books, and there's tons of children's books that even young toddlers can understand and follow along with. And like story at its basic level is much more understandable than lists or rules or poetry or whatever. The bad news, though, is that the biblical authors don't value the same details that we value in our Western culture. And so sometimes this can lead us to misinterpret the stories or lead us into only scraping the surface when there's so much depth held within the pages there. And so because they leave out those details, we can often miss some of them. Now, God could have written just a rule book. He really could have, but instead He chose to communicate with us in the way that we genuinely best understand. And when it comes to narrative, there are several things that are important to focus on, and that's really what we're going to talk about in the coming in the coming lesson, and really next week as well. And those things that I want to focus on, they are plot, character, setting, numbers, and design patterns, or really like literary themes. Now, this might sound pretty basic, but it is really, really important, and that's why I want to start with this one here, and that is plot. Now, if you lose sight of the plot, this can lead things to you losing sight on or interpreting things out of context. And so I want to show you an example here. And we are going to visit a website called ZoomQuilt. If you give me a second, I will pull that up. Okay, so we are on ZoomQuilt here, and If you just take a look right here at this scene, what you'll see is kind of an odd scene going here, and this is a piece of art, so this is going to be kind of weird. It's not really, you're not supposed to get a ton of meaning out of it, but we can look at this right here, and generally speaking, we see two army men sitting here watching a giant tentacled monster attack a village here. There's like a hole in the ground and everything right in front of it, and we're just kind of watching this monster. And this would be what you would say if the story, like if I were to ask you, what is this story about? It'd be about a monster attacking, maybe an alien monster attacking the planet, right? That's what you'd say. But if I were to suddenly zoom you out a little bit, suddenly you find that you're in a very different setting here. And as we keep zooming out, what we see is that, oh my goodness, here you are in in this weird staircase thing, and that's something that's off in the distance. That's not actually a very big part of the plot, but here we have this land of cheese and forks and weird staircases, and and you find yourself in a very strange place. But once again, if this was all we focused on, you would miss the point. Because if we zoom out even further, what we see is, oh, we came out of that hole in the ground. Now we're looking at the monster from the top here. Um, and again, this is very abstract. This is, don't take too much meaning, but we're now looking at the same monster, but we're to assume, from a different perspective. And so, almost, are we looking into this parallel universe? And this is traveling through the black hole to get here that the monster traveled through. Is this something different? Or if you keep zooming out, you'll see that we're in a movie theater, and all of this was just a movie. And so, if we were to take that first original concept of a monster going like attacking a city and look at that, you would miss the fact that in reality, what we're looking at here is a movie. Somebody's watching a movie, and so this is a abstract piece of art. Don't think too deeply into this here, but what I want you to see is that depending on where you're at in the story, if you were to look only at that element, you might get a very different picture of what's going on here than if you were to continue on looking at, and again, I could even keep zooming in here. This goes on and on and on, and there's so many different pieces of story here as you go through this. And the fact is, if you only look at one element, you miss the whole picture. And you can zoom on this particular zoomquilt2.com if you're curious to play around with it. There's a Zoom Quilt 1 as well. But there, it's kind of fun. It's an interesting idea, but I think it's a really good illustration of just to get us an idea of like we have to, when it comes to plot, we have to pay attention to the entire story, not just where we're at in the plot. So let's look at an example of this. Look at the story of Gideon here. When we think about Gideon, we often think about Gideon testing God with the fleece. Let me read the passage for you because again, this is a very common part of the story of Gideon, and I think I just want to read it to refresh your memory. But when I think of Gideon, a lot of times is one of the first things I'm going to think about in the story. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." And that is what happened. Gideon rose up early the next day, squeezed the fleece, and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time make the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew." And that night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered in dew. So that's the story, Judges 6:36-40, right there, about the fleece. Now, if you were to read just the story, what do you think that you would get out of it? Well, you'd think that a viable method to determine the will of God was to test him, to put, and we know it as the sentence, to lay out a fleece. Well, I put out a fleece to figure out what it was. He tested God to see if this is indeed God's will. But what the fact is that this is not an accurate way to discern God's will, and we should not take it from the story. And in fact, this is not at all what the story is saying. In order to understand the story, what's going on here, we have to look at the whole story of Gideon. what we see here is but merely a window, a single chapter in the story that is Gideon's life. And in fact, the author wants us to see so much more. And if all you see is a handbook on how to interpret the will of God, you'll have missed the point, especially because this is not even a good way to interpret the will of God. So Israel, thinking about the whole story, I'm just going to give you a bullet point summary here. Israel is under oppression by a people group called the Midianites. And God shows up to talk to Gideon and tell him that he will be the one to defeat the Midianites and save Israel. That God is going to use Gideon. But Gideon is afraid and asks God for a sign to prove that it's really him that he's talking to. He's standing there talking to the angel of the Lord. And he asks God to wait until Gideon comes back with a sacrifice. And when Gideon makes the sacrifice, God causes the sacrifice to just be consumed with fire. In this moment, this big display, and the angel of the Lord disappears into the fire. And then God tells Gideon to tear down an altar to another god. But Gideon, even after the display that, oh, I'm really talking to God here, God's really the one instructing me, when he's instructed to tear down this other altar, he's too afraid to just go out and do it in the middle of the day, and so he waits till everybody goes to sleep. He sneaks out and he tears it down at night, and then everybody wakes up and is mad and trying to figure out who it is, and so what we see here, just from the first part of this story here, is that Gideon is a coward, and that he really struggles with trusting God. He really struggles with trusting God. And then Gideon is about to fight the Midianites, and this is where you see him ask for the sign of the fleece twice, so that, as he says, I will know that you will save Israel by my hand. And so, even though he has already tested God once, and God has shown him this magnificent display of fire, he trusted God and tore down the altars and destroyed the idols, and nothing bad happened to him. And now he's about to go fight this nation, that's this enemy nation, and he still doubts God to the point where he then tests him not once, but 2 times with a fleece. And at this point, you can see that the plot conflict is not how will Gideon discern the will of God, but rather when will this faithless coward get his act together and start to trust God? When is it going to happen? This guy keeps doubting God. He gets all these signs, and like so many of us don't get any signs at all. And like Gideon gets like three, 3 to 4 of them, and yet he still can't seem to trust God. And so this is the plot point. This is what we're supposed to take from it. Not that you should put a fleece out, but instead, if you continue reading, you'll see that Gideon, he gathers these 30,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites. And then God turns things around on Gideon, and he begins to test him. So instead of Gideon testing God, now God says, okay, now I'm going to test you because you tested me. And so God shrinks Gideon's army of 30,000 people down to 300. And not only that, but it's 300 of the weakest men. And then he tells Gideon to surround the Midianite camp at night and make this huge racket, just like blow these trumpets and break these pots. And what happens is that the enemy camp wakes up in a panic and they start killing each other. And all of this is while Gideon and his army of 300 men stand safely from a distance at the top of the mountain, watching this slaughter happen amongst them as God confuses the camp. And that's the story of Gideon. So what is the story of Gideon? What's the point of Gideon? And the point, when you look at the entirety of the book of Gideon, of the story of Gideon, what you'll see is that God can and will use heavily flawed people to do so much more than they could have imagined. Even and that God works within, even it makes concessions for Gideon and works within Gideon's weakness and says, okay, you doubt, you shouldn't, but here is a sign. And so, but the point of the story is that God, it does not matter if you are weak or strong, he can use you to do an incredible thing that's so much more than you could have imagined. And once you read the story of Gideon, then you can zoom out even further and see it in the context of the book of Judges, because that is just one story and a compilation of stories. And the book is filled with these stories of these deeply flawed leaders who God is using to do these incredible things. on behalf of his people, even though they have rejected him. And so then you zoom out even further and you see how the book of Judges fits within Scripture, because it follows immediately after Deuteronomy, where Moses instructs the Israelites to remember the works of God and always follow his commands, but instead they forget God, and as Judges says over and over again, every man does what's right in his own eyes. Which leads us to Ruth, which is this explores this power of redemption in 1st and 2nd Samuel, where you see God establish a king for Israel, but it doesn't go as planned with Saul. So God establishes David as a king and renews his covenant to bring about the Messiah through the line of David, etc., etc., etc. And suddenly, when we've zoomed in initially at a story of a fleece, as you zoom out, you get more details. As you zoom out a little further, you get more details in the context of the book. And then you can look at the book in the context of the surrounding books, and so on and so forth. And before you know it, you've figured out how this book fits in with the entirety of the Bible. And so in our modern culture, we forget that sometimes, like, we're so used to being given the details that we have to take the little details that we're given and we're look at the plot and say, okay, where am I at in the story here? What is going on? And zoom out and zoom out and zoom out and see the story as a whole. Don't let yourself get fixated on individual parts of the story. And yes, there can be lessons within individual parts of the story, and we can zoom in real close and inspect them. But you always, 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 when you inspect key elements of the plot, what you have to do is you have to keep in context, keep in mind where you came from, where you're at in the story. Now, in our modern culture, we are used to lots of details about characters and stories. And I talked about this some last week, but character is the next part of reading narrative that's really important to keep in mind. And so we know nowadays what they look like, their origin stories, their motives, and whenever details are left out, they can act as a significant theme in the story. As I said last week, you wonder uh, who the mysterious stranger is and how they came to save the day, but nobody knows where they came from or how they got so powerful. And so the rest of the movie is following the development of that character, and part of the resolution of the story and the plot is figuring out the backstory of that character. We're used to that. That's the Western mindset of storytelling. That's how it works. Biblical authors do the exact opposite most of the time. When they give us details and backstory and descriptions, most of the what stuff we want to know is left out, and the few that we get, they're so important for the story. They're so important. And so there's two things to pay attention when it comes to reading biblical characters. If you really want to dive deep, that's their description and their names. Their names are often symbolic. So let's start with description here. When the authors describe a person, you'll find that the description often is important to fully grasping the whole story. And so this can be their appearance or even their outfit sometimes. So let me give you some examples here. Saul and David, for example. Saul, the description we get of Saul in 1 Samuel 9:1 is that he had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Now, Saul is described as tall. That's the description that you get. He's impressive. He's good looking. He's tall. This is Saul. David, however, he's described as young and red faced when Samuel anoints him, and he's short when he doesn't fit into Saul's armor. And so we know that David is short, red in the face, and young. Saul is tall and looks the part of a king, is good looking. Everybody looks at him and is like, man, I want to follow that guy. And Saul's height looks and matches his power and his stereotypical kingliness, but it also goes along and parallels his love for status and his pride and his love for his power that destroys him. And so we see the description of Saul as tall is intentional for the author. The author wants you to think about these things and see that he looks the part. Have you ever looked at somebody and said they look like they would be rich, or they look like they would be a nerd, or they look like you have a stereotype in mind? And so what the author's doing is he is taking those stereotypes and he's saying, hey, tall, good-looking guy. Oh yeah, of course he's the king. Oh yeah, and of course he's snooty and power hungry and loves his status and so on and so forth. Whereas David, his short stature matches humility and his willingness to let God work through his weakness. And his red face, it matches his passion for the Lord, which comes out. And so David's description fits with his character. Let's look at another example. This one, Goliath. Let's look at the description we're given. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. Okay, so we're told his height, and that's to call to mind the giant Nephilim from the early on in Genesis. And then we're told what he's wearing, and that's very important because his scaled armor is supposed to remind you of some other character that you've seen who is scaly from the Garden of Eden, and that is the serpent. And so Saul plays the role of the serpent. And what is the promise in the Garden of Eden? The serpent's head would be crushed one day by the Messiah, by the seed of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent. Well, what does David do to Goliath's head? He crushes it. Goliath is the serpent. It goes much deeper than that. But this is you're supposed to see this. The author wants you to see these details. Other characters, Jacob and Esau. Let's look at how they're described. Genesis 27:11. Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, "But my brother Esau is a hairy man, while I have smooth skin." Jacob has smooth skin. His smooth skin parallels his slippery and deceptive nature. Throughout the entire story, Jacob is like deceiving people and sneaky. And Jacob's not a great guy in a lot of ways. And then Esau is hairy, and that matches his very animal-like personality. He shows up and all he wants is food, and he devours his food. He's like, yeah, I don't care about my birthright and inheritance. You just take it. I just want this bowl of soup. And so he sells his birthright for a bowl of soup because he just wants to eat and hunt and do manly animal-like things. And that's Esau. And that fits with his personality. And so this is another example of how character descriptions can look. But another one is name meaning. The meaning of someone's name can really be important sometimes to getting insight into the story. It's not always the case, but often further insight into a character or a story can be gained by looking at the names that we are given. And so even further than that, God sometimes will even change a character's name if they change or he calls them to something different. Think Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah. And so we see several characters that undergo name changes throughout Scripture, and we're supposed to see a change in how that character acts. Now, we were just talking about Jacob, right? Jacob means deceiver. Literally, that's what his name means. Abraham means father of a multitude. He is the father of the nation. In fact, Abram means father, and when God makes the covenant with Abraham that he'll start a great nation, he changes it to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude. Saul is the king that everybody asked for, right? His name means the one asked for. Adam, any guesses on what Adam is? It is exactly the word for human. Adam, the human. And so it's essentially like when you name your dog, Adam means human. He was a human. Eve means life giver. She's the one from whose womb all of humanity comes from. And so Adam and Eve are human and life giver, or life bearer. So interesting details here. Again, these sometimes aren't necessarily for knowing what's going on in a story or understanding, but they can really help when you want to get deeper meaning into them. Another fun example are Ruth's in the book of Ruth, the two brothers that die, Ruth's husband and Orpah's husband at the very beginning. They mean sicko. Their names literally mean sicko and done for, and they're in for like all of 2 verses, and they get sick and die. Sicko and done for is what their names are. So they're there. The story is there. Now, the setting of a story can also cue the reader into what kind of story you're reading or what will happen in that story. And so this can be really important for us sometimes if we're looking um, at a narrative, is where does it take place. Now, we do the same exact thing today with movies and books and everything. So let's do a fun little challenge. Just as you, I'm going to show you a picture, and I'll give you just a second before I say it. Um, I want you to tell me what genre of movie would the following setting be in. What genre of movie would this picture be? Be horror, right? Horror, thriller, creepy movie, right? Well, and ask yourself why. Look at it. I mean, it's graveyard. It's at night. It's got a creepy house. It looks like it's falling over. All right, next up, Western, right? A Western. It's got set out west. It's on a ranch looking place. Like this is a Western. What about this one? Science fiction. Instantly, easy. Oh, we're in space. There's a cool looking spaceship. Yep, science fiction. How about this one? Fantasy. We've got a lamppost. We have crazy waterfalls and a castle and beautiful skyline and mountains. Like this is right here. Fantasy. I mean, it fits the genre. Okay, so we use when it comes to setting, we use location, we use music, we use lighting. All of these things come together to create a setting for movies that audiences recognize. And a good director will take those settings and they'll switch them up or combine settings in order to make a point. And so the settings, like instantly, you see a creepy old house, and you expect it's going to be haunted. It's going to be creepy. But what if you know, what if the sweetest, funniest person lives there that's so nice and that like everybody loves, and you see that that person is who goes in and lives there. Suddenly, things don't fit. That's not what you expect, and like you go in and you get invited, and inside it's this beautifully, immaculately clean, well lit space. Like that would throw you for a loop, and a director could use that to their advantage to tell a story and make you feel things. And so we recognize the elements of a setting so that when that setting is switched up, it can evoke very different feelings or help bring a point home. And so I want to show you just a really fun example of this here. And that fun example, it's going to be uh, this is somebody has taken a trailer, made a trailer for Mary Poppins, which, right? We've all seen Mary Poppins, the crazy, funny nanny who shows up and does all sorts of wild supercalifragilisticexpialidocious things, and just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. It's a classic old Disney movie, right? What this person did is they just recut it so that it looks like it's a horror movie. And so I want to show this to you because I want you to keep in mind just how easy it is to take something that is so happy, so cheerful, so lighthearted, and just make a couple changes to the setting and the music and the way that it's cut. And what it does is it changes how that setting looks, and it communicates something entirely different to us.
Stay awake, don't rest your head, don't lie down upon your bed.
Okay. So that's a goofy, crazy illustration, example here of how setting, when it's changed up, it can really mess with us. And so Biblical authors use settings and locations all the time. Let me give you some examples. The Garden of Eden, the perfect place where God and humans live together in harmony, and we lost that harmony with the fall as we were kicked out of the garden, right? And throughout the Bible, the goal is to return to Eden. Now, as part of this theme, one setting that we often see are directions like the east and the west. And so, after he drove the man out on the east side of the garden, cherubim and a flaming sword flashed back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. So, when you see people headed to the east, it is typically a symbol of exile and living in sin. And so, when people move toward the west, that is typically for people following God and returning to Eden, right? And so, the directions of east and west are not always explicitly given. Um, but sometimes the authors expect you to know the geography. And so, for example, here, um, God calls Abraham out of the east in Ur to the promised land of Canaan in the west. And that symbolizes the return, people's return to Eden, the promised land, right? God's people who would be established back in Eden. And so Israel is taken into exile. When they're taken into exile, after they sin, they are taken to Babylon in the east, right? East and west. Follow that. You're going to suddenly unlock all sorts of new truths within the story. Sometimes, like I said, not going to be explicitly talked about. Another one, Egypt. First time we see Egypt is when Abraham leaves the promised land that God has for him in a famine to find food. And he then makes this bad decision that gets him in this situation where Pharaoh has taken his wife Sarah, and God rescues Abraham by sending these plagues that attack Pharaoh because Pharaoh took Abraham's wife. And so then Abraham's descendants, many years later, they make a bunch of bad decisions and they send their brother into slavery in Egypt, where and this is Joseph, and they themselves then go in search of food during a famine, and God rescues them in Egypt, right? But because of that, they then end up enslaved in Egypt, persecuted by Pharaoh. God sends a bunch of plagues again, and he rescues them from the slavery to return to the promised land. So Egypt, just through the book of Genesis into Exodus, Egypt becomes a place where God's people end up because they made bad decisions, but God always comes through and rescues them, right? This is what Egypt represents here. And so God tells Israel to never go back to Egypt for any reason. They're told this. That means that whenever we see future characters have any relationship with Egypt, we're supposed to cringe. Solomon gets his horses straight from Egypt. Ooh, you're supposed to cringe at that. Egypt. You don't want to associate with them, right? That is where bad things happen. And so the authors then switch things up with the story of Jesus. So where we have this established relationship. You see Egypt, you're like, oh no. And people go down to Egypt and like, oh, that was not a good move. They shouldn't have done that. And so skip to the birth of Jesus. Herod is looking to kill Jesus, and Mary and Joseph, they flee to Egypt with Jesus for refuge. And as the reader, you're like, oh boy, here we are. We've switched, like we talked about and showed with this funny video. Like when you switch things up, suddenly you're like, oh no, that's not good. Like they're gonna go to Egypt here, and this shouldn't happen. Um, they've got the Messiah. Like this is a mistake. But they don't go to Egypt because of a bad decision that they made, but instead they go to Egypt because the king in Israel is acting like Pharaoh killing the babies. It's supposed to shock you and show you that the state of Israel has become Egypt. You have to go to Egypt to escape Israel because Israel has become the place that you didn't want to associate with. Here they are. They switch the theme up on you. And there are lots of other settings like this. There are lots of places where throughout Scripture, like you see that you're supposed to understand one thing, and then sometimes that setting will change or morph or be merged with others. So we've got Babylon, we've got Jerusalem, we've got Bethlehem, we've got Moab, we have the wilderness. Like all of these show up over and over and over again in Scripture. Sometimes Egypt and Babylon are kind of meshed together. Like Babylon becomes this archetype that sets up this precedent for the just this is the evil nation, and so the nation of Babylon becomes more of an idea than even necessarily just a nation. You've got Jerusalem, which can be merged with Eden sometimes, and Zion, and so they come together. But like all these locations here, Bethlehem comes with David and the Messiah. Moab, you don't want to deal with them, but oh, it switches up. Ruth, who gets incorporated into the Moabites. Or Ruth, who gets incorporated into the Messiah line of the Messiah, is the grandmother of David. Like that Ruth, she was a Moabitess, and you were not supposed to go around them. They were bad people. The wilderness, like all these things, they change and they're used, and you're to read them. And so when you see that shift, you're supposed to catch it. It's intentional. So I've gone on long enough. There's more that we will talk about in next week's lesson. I'll continue this. Hopefully, this gives you a little bit more to go about in your reading challenge. Pay attention to some of these things. Look for them. They're there. So, as always, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll see you next week.